The Legend of Zelda. It's a franchise near and dear to my heart. In fact, other than Metroid, it may be my favorite series of all time. And yet, despite the love I have for Zelda, there was one game I had yet to experience. That game was Majora's Mask. Was is the key word there. You see, I've owned Majora's Mask for years, but for some reason I just never got around to playing it. And when Nintendo re-released the game on the 3DS, I finally gave it a shot. And after I did, I knew I had to talk about all the things that make it so special. But before we can do that, I think I have to talk a little bit about the Zelda franchise as a whole first. My first experience with Zelda wasn't actually playing one of the games. It was watching one of my friends play through Ocarina of Time on the N64. I was enthralled by the grandeur of it all. From the large open plains of Hyrule Field to the many interesting characters and locations found within the world of Hyrule itself. At the time, I'd never seen anything like it, as I was used to the two-dimensional confines of the Game Boy Color. Ever since that point, I was hooked. As I've grown older and played more and more Zelda titles, it's hard not to notice certain things about the franchise, though. The Legend of Zelda series is extremely formulaic and by the books. At least, the mainline console releases have been. Ever since A Link to the Past, Zelda games have pretty much stuck to the same basic blueprint. They always start you off on the hunt for 3 sacred items, whether it be medallions, or spiritual stones, or pearls, you get the idea. You'll go through temples, finding new equipment in each one that'll help you get through it and fight the bosses within each temple using that equipment, and your end goal is almost always the same. Save Zelda by defeating that giant pig monster, or the humanoid version of said pig monster. That's not to say that the games suffer because of their conventional nature, though. The strength of the Zelda series comes from its world building and characters, as well as its incredible mechanics and design. Those aforementioned temples are lovingly crafted and are full of wonderfully designed puzzles and fights, but rarely have the adventures deviated from the standard design and progression choices. Zelda 2 was really the only console release to drastically change things up, and I mean, come on, that was the second game in the entire series. Other titles make minor adjustments from controls to the method of travel, but don't do too much else. This is why Majora's Mask is such a big surprise. After the huge success that was Ocarina of Time, and after playing so many Zelda games with the same basic formula, I was shocked to see Nintendo had gone in such a bold direction with the direct sequel to their N64 masterpiece. I knew it was different, but without having experienced it beforehand, I didn't know what to expect. Nintendo could have easily made another Ocarina, but instead they went and made this incredibly weird thing in Majora's Mask, both by Zelda standards and Nintendo standards. But none of this would matter if the changes they made weren't any good. So let's put on our thinking mask and break down why Majora's Mask is so cool. When you start up Majora's Mask, things seem fairly typical, especially if you're coming from Ocarina of Time. There's an air of familiarity as you're riding Epona through the forest with similar visuals and sounds. But almost immediately following the opening cutscene, you're introduced to one of the defining mechanics of Majora: the masks. While they essentially work as items, they diversify the way the player interacts with the world. The 4 main masks, known as the transformation masks, will give Link different abilities that will allow him to get around Termina in various ways, and you'll be using them throughout the adventure. The many other masks you can find will allow you to complete side quests, and others like the Bunny Hood give you special abilities. The masks aren't totally new to Zelda, though. It's likely players got an introduction to masks in Ocarina of Time, and this only highlights one of the main things I noticed about Majora's Mask. It's both completely different and familiar at the same time, but we'll talk more about that a little later. While the masks are neat, the biggest and most obvious change to the Zelda formula comes in the form of the 3-day time cycle. I wasn't sure how I would react to this mechanic, but after experiencing it, I can't help but think it's absolutely brilliant. What it adds to the world is unlike any Zelda game before or after it. Because of this time cycle, Termina feels more alive and more alluring. Characters have always been a huge part of the Zelda series, and in Majora's Mask, they're more intriguing than ever. Almost each one has their own story, and unraveling these curious stories becomes all the more compelling when time comes into play. The advantage of the time cycle is that the NPCs all have schedules. Different characters do different things in different ways at different places and at different times of each day and each night. And depending on whether you intervene with these characters, you can cause certain events to branch out in different directions. There are a bevy of side quests that deal specifically with this mechanic, and it's just as much a part of Majora's Mask as any other aspect of the game. It's just one of the reasons why I feel as if it's one of the most dynamic and interesting Zelda titles by far. The time cycle affects the characters within Majora, but it also means that the player must fight against not only the antagonists found in Termina, but the clock as well. As each day passes, there's a greater sense of urgency as the massive, menacing moon tumbles closer and closer to the Earth. The moon, along with the, yes, moodier atmosphere that I love, adds a great sense of tension to go along with that urgency. Do you keep trucking along, or do you turn back time and start fresh? The clock makes you almost have to strategically plan out your actions beforehand, and finishing off objectives you set for yourself with only minutes to spare is extremely satisfying. Of course, you may never find yourself having to worry about the clock if you're careful, but it does allow for varying playstyles. Some people may not like the fact that you have to go back in time over and over and over again throughout the adventure, but without this time cycle, Majora's Mask wouldn't be Majora's Mask. It's the main thing that sets it apart from the many other Zelda games that are out there and is easily the most daring deviation Nintendo has ever experimented with in Zelda. If you feel constrained by the time, you can always slow it down and get more done in a cycle. And if you need to get to a certain time of day for a side quest or any other objective, you can warp ahead to a time that's at least close. But even with such big changes to the formula, Majora's Mask still has a breath of familiarity to it. Longtime players of Zelda got a taste of time travel with Ocarina of Time, as well as the differences that time can make within the world. The day and night cycle allowed for a much simpler version of the time cycle that's present in Majora's Mask, as different events happen during the daytime and nighttime. The time cycle in Majora feels like the logical progression of that day and night cycle in Ocarina. Clock Town feels like a larger version of Hyrule Castle Town. The Ocarina, which was the main item in Ocarina of Time as the name suggests, also has a big role in Majora's Mask. Many of the same songs are present and they do the same things. Similarly, so many of the items that you're used to seeing make a return in Majora's Mask as well, including those masks I mentioned earlier. And yes, there are still temples to explore and puzzles to solve within them in typical Zelda fashion, just not as many as you may be used to. Nintendo deviated from the norm, but they did so without creating a foreign experience. Majora's Mask subverts so many of the tropes found within the Zelda franchise today, and the fact that it was initially released less than 2 years after Ocarina of Time is astounding. While I don't know if it's my favorite game in the franchise, it's definitely near the top. The music is marvelous, the updated 3DS visuals are vibrant, and it's absolutely a game worth playing. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, do all those things that everyone always does. Like, comment, and subscribe. Those help me out. And if you want to go check out more Zelda-related content, you can go check out Boku no Eruption's video on Zelda clones, as well as Wally the Legends video on Zelda the Four Swords Adventures. And finally, you may have noticed that my channel design has sort of changed, and I want to thank Nico for helping me out with redoing all that stuff. If you want to check him out, you can find him on Twitter. It's in the description, and it's also on this end slate. But yeah, anyway, bye.